The NFL season is officially here, and as always, there's teams that seem better than what they are. In the AFC and the NFC, there's two teams that stand above the rest when it comes to having a great year last season, but are going to be in the downfall this year. And I'll start off in the AFC. And that team to keep an eye on for falling down and regressing is the Baltimore Ravens. The Ravens made some interesting moves this offseason. They brought in Derrick Henry, they brought in Nate Wiggins to the draft, but then they let a lot of good players go. On their offensive line, they lost starters Kevin Zeitler, John Simpson, and Morgan Moses. So they have a bunch of backups now replacing them. They didn't acquire anyone through the draft nor free agency. At left tackle, they have Ronnie Stanley, who's a very good left tackle, but is known to be injury prone. So they regressed upon the offensive line. On top of that, they made a lateral decision at the running back position, bringing in Derrick Henry, someone who has a lot more hype to his name than what his play style and numbers indicate. Or maybe it's just a credit to Gus Edwards and the production that he gave Baltimore last season. All in all, the idea of Derrick Henry transcending this offense is a very foolish idea because Derrick Henry is just a bigger name version of Gus Edwards. What is Derrick Henry primarily going to be used for? Goal line touchdown touches. And what did Gus Edwards just demolish last season? Goal line touches. He converted every time he had the ball in his hand, and he scored a lot of touchdowns. There's no difference between him and Derrick Henry. In fact, if you look at the yards per carry, Derrick Henry averaged 4.2, while Gus Edwards averaged 4.1. The difference is non-existent. The one area where they should have improved offensively was the wide receiver core. Zay Flowers is solid, but I'm not sure how much of a second step he can really take, especially when he has no one aside from him to help alleviate pressure. Number two wide receiver on this team is Rashad Bateman, someone who I've had a lot of excitement for, but has shown in the past 3 years in the league that there isn't really much more for him to peak out at. And understanding that, Baltimore's taking a big risk on thinking they have a solid receiving core. For their sake, hopefully Bateman does work out, but history has shown us that he probably is not the answer. And even if he is, they probably could have used a bit of a veteran presence at wide receiver. So the receiving core is going to remain the same. Their other best player, their best receiver, in my opinion, is Mark Andrews. The issue with Mark Andrews is he's returning from an injury. I hope that he is extremely solid. But again, reality is you're coming off an injury and you're a 29-year-old player. The chances of you being the same aren't necessarily favorable. So overall, their offense is bound to regress. Now you flip it to the other side of the ball on the defense. Their defense took a big hit this season in terms of just players leaving. The heart and soul of their team, one of their leaders, aside from Roquan Smith, was Patrick Queen. Patrick Queen ended up leaving the team in free agency to join the Steelers. You lose one of your best linebackers, someone who had triple-digit tackles last year, to free agency, and your linebacker group becomes weaker. Then you look at the defensive pass rush unit, and it also takes a hit. Last year, they were one of the best teams in total sacks. Matabuke was amazing. Clowney, Kyle Van Noy, all excelled on the defensive line. But Jadeveon Clowney left to join the Carolina Panthers, their second leading sack leader. And then Kyle Van Noy returned, but he's a year older. Can he really repeat this production? So they lose a star player at linebacker. They're regressing in terms of their front seven, the defensive line, and their secondary is solid. I like Nate Wiggins. That's their one improvement to this team, is they brought in another corner who I think is going to excel opposite side of Marlon Humphrey. But in the safety unit, they lost a big player in Geno Stone. He had 7 interceptions last year. Now, that is hard to replicate, and the expectation would never be for him to come back and get 7 interceptions, but he was really helpful to his team in coverage. You lose Geno Stone, you replace him with Eddie Jackson. And if you look at the numbers from last year, again, a player that fell off in production and is becoming older. Usually, when you look at the numbers, they're not really indicative of a player when they are younger. But when it's a guy who's come into the league and hasn't performed in his whole career there, that's one thing. And when it's a player who's entering the back end of his career, hitting his 30s, that's also another thing. And that's the issue when you look at the Baltimore Ravens. The players they brought in, and Derrick Henry and Eddie Jackson, they're getting older. And the player they're counting on to take a big step has shown over the past several years that he just maybe isn't capable of it yet. And that's Rashad Bateman. Now, for the Ravens' sake, you hope it works out. But the reality is they're probably going to regress. And on top of that, the issue for Baltimore is they're now in a division that is going to be a lot harder than what it was last year. The Bengals are bound to be better because Joe Burrow is healthy. And if he can remain healthy, he's an MVP level quarterback and he's a top three quarterback in the league. Pittsburgh's bound to improve. They won 9 games with Kenny Pickett last year. Russell Wilson is a lot better than Kenny Pickett. So if that stays going, the Steelers would be a new and improved team, potentially winning double-digit games. And defensively, they just improved. They took away actually one of the Ravens' best players, Patrick Queen, and they're always, always, always top of the line under head coach Mike Tomlin. So they're in a tougher division, and they're a team that is set up with a lot of players who could regress. So the team to beware of in the AFC are the Baltimore Ravens. Now looking at the NFC, a team that could regress and is probably bound to regress is the Dallas Cowboys. The Cowboys last season had a really good regular season. They went 12-5, but there was a method to their madness of success. And that was they were beating the teams they were supposed to beat. They had a very light schedule last year. But when it came to playing the tougher games, playing the tougher teams like the Detroit Lions, they laid an egg and they couldn't beat those teams. And then they went out to the playoffs and got humiliated on their home field against the Green Bay Packers. Now, that wasn't going to be the last opinion I had of them. It wasn't me based off of how the last season ended. It was mainly, what are they going to do in the offseason to address it? Unfortunately for Cowboys Nation, they didn't do anything to address it. Their offensive line, I truly believe, will be solid despite losing players like Tyron Smith and Tyler Biazzi to free agency. They brought in some really good rookies in Connor Beebe and Guyton. They're going to be really good players on this offensive line. And if there's one thing we know about Dallas is that their offensive line will always remain strong. But then you look at the weapons that Dak Prescott has around him. He has CeeDee Lamb, who I think is super talented, but there's no one around CeeDee, both in the backfield and in the receiving core, that's going to help alleviate pressure off of Lamb. And Lamb can still have a successful season, get 100, 150 yards a game, but just because you pass for 150 yards a game doesn't mean that you'll win. The issue with Dallas is that they don't have anyone else to turn to aside from Lamb. So they need to expect a big game out of him, or else they're going to fall flat on their face offensively. When you look at the receiving core with Brandon Cooks, Jalen Tolbert, Jake Ferguson, I don't think these players are players that the Dallas Cowboys can bank on being successful. On top of that, they don't have a backfield or running game to rely on to open up the passing game, right? It's one thing to have a really strong backfield where it's like, hey, we have a Saquon Barkley per se, right, in the backfield. And if we hand him off the ball, well, it can open up the offense, right? Because it's going to keep the defense honest. You can't allow the extra backers to go out there and cover. Unfortunately, that's not the case. They're banking on an old Zeke Elliott and an old Dalvin Cook to find a spark, and I just don't think it's there. I'm a big Elliott fan, but I just don't think that spark is there. He can be solid, but he can't necessarily be a running back one who's getting 20 to 25 carries a game and somebody you can really rely heavily on. Now, unfortunately for Dak Prescott and the Cowboys, not having a good run game is really going to hurt this team. Here's an interesting stat about how Dak Prescott performs when his team rushes for over 100 yards and when they rush for below 100 yards each game. When the Dallas Cowboys, when Dak Prescott's the quarterback, rush for over 100 yards per game, they're 64-17. And the games where they rushed for less than 100 yards per game, they were 9-24. On top of that, in the playoffs, when he has a running back and a team that rushes for over 100 yards a game, they are 2-2. Without a running back that goes or running game that goes for over 100 yards per game, in the playoffs, they are 0-3. And not having a backfield is really going to backfire because numbers like that and opening up the field and having someone you can count on if the passing game's not working. Defensively, they're going to take a big hit too. They didn't make any moves this offseason to address their defensive needs. On top of that, they were banking on players like Deron Bland to come back and Trayvon Diggs to form a really strong cornerback duo after letting Stephon Gilmore walk in free agency. Unfortunately for them, Deron Bland is going to be out for the next 6 to 7 weeks with an injury. They also lost Dan Quinn as their defensive coordinator. And without Dan Quinn, I think this defense is going to continue to take a big hit because he's a mastermind. That's why he's a head coach, and that's why he had success in Seattle. That's why he was hired and really wanted to be retained by Dallas to be their defensive coordinator. And that's why he has a new coaching job with Washington. It's because he's really good at the defensive side of the ball. And without Dan Quinn, I do think this defense regresses. And the last thing I know about Dallas is their offensive play calling and their head coach by Mike McCarthy is going to hold them back. in terms of he's not somebody that you can count on when it comes to play calling that can win you games. There's certain coaches in the NFL that can turn dust into gold. You hand them any quarterback, no matter how bad or how good they are, and they just find a way to win. The Sean McVays of the world, the Kyle Shanahans of the world, the Andy Reids of the world. Unfortunately, Mike McCarthy is just a lesser version of Andy Reid. Somebody that he can try and model his coaching after, but just isn't going to be living up to that Andy Reid expertise. So by having a run game that isn't effective enough to wear out a defense, by not having a passing game that is good enough to win in a shootout, and by not having a strong defense to help you win close games, I really think Dallas is set up for a rough season. You guys let me know what you guys think about the Cowboys and the Ravens possibly regressing entering this next season. I'm excited to see what you guys think. And as always, thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe.